Welcome back, everybody. My name is Brian DeLong, and I'm the Director of Debate at Indiana University. And this is a part of a video podcast series called Winning the H2O Debates for the 2021 to 2022 high school debate topic on protections of water resources in the United States. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Rebecca Lave, who is the chair of the Geography Department here at Indiana University, to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Rebecca, I provided you with a little bit of a background of what high school students will be debating this year. Do you have any opening thoughts about, from the mindset of a high school student dipping their toe into the water of the topic? What are some of the core issues that they should be looking for?
So this is sort of a delightfully huge issue. So I think it's great that you all have this to work with. You're going to have a lot of fun figuring out the different aspects of this. But some things that I would point you towards. So one is the question of the extent of federal control over water already and what's included and what's excluded. So, I think there's some great questions around the fact that the Clean Water Act almost entirely excludes agricultural land, right? It's really, really great about thinking about impacts from particular sources, which are called point sources. So the pipe that comes out of a factory, or the place where a sewer outlet gets into a river. And it's pretty terrible about thinking about non-point source pollution, which is stuff that's kind of washing in from large areas without one specific source. And in fact, agriculture was explicitly excluded from the Clean Water Act when it was initially drafted, in order to secure the support of Midwestern states, right? So that means that if you've heard about things like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, or if you've seen algae blooms, eutrophication, things along those lines, the Clean Water Act isn't set up to deal with those very well. So I think that's a really interesting issue. Another thing has to do about connections between surface water and groundwater. That is an active issue of litigation right now in the US, because groundwater matters enormously for both the kind of ecological aspects of water, right? Making sure that aquatic organisms like fish and insects and stuff can survive, but it also matters for water quality and for, there's a bunch of interconnected stuff that has to do with groundwater. So that's another really cool one. Another thing that I think is really amazing is debates about water allocation and the legality of water rights, which, in the US, there are two different sets of water law, depending on what part of the country you're in. But in the Western US, which is where we're dealing with water shortages that are the most serious right now, the water is allocated based on these kind of previous agreements that were made at a time of unusual water prevalence. That's the wrong word for it. There was unusual water abundance. And so now we're in these incredible times of drought, and these agreements don't work anymore. So how do we renegotiate those? That's another great issue.
But on that particular question, so we did have a previous guest that talked about kind of the distinction between what he called riparian water rights on the East Coast versus West Coast management of water. Maybe you can provide us, so obviously students have to negate this idea of the US federal government increasing water protections in the United States. What kind of examples can you provide of maybe attempts at good faith efforts? It sounds good, but maybe resulted in unfortunate consequences that were potentially predictable or not predicted during those discussions about policy matters.
Yeah, so here's one that makes me think we need to be more careful about groundwater. So one of the things that has been increasingly, let's see, so the initial basis for a lot of the management of rivers in the US was economic, right? We're arguing about highest and best use, which doesn't mean environmental use. That was interpreted almost entirely to mean the highest best use in terms of the literal monetary value it's producing, right? But then it became clear to us that we were taking so much water out of rivers and streams that everything was dying. Okay, so then we couldn't have these other uses of it. So as water law has adapted and as regulation has adapted to try to do flow management is what it's typically called, so that we have enough flow in a river or stream for things to survive, farmers have turned to pumping groundwater instead. Because if they can't take as much as they want out of surface water, they'll take it from the ground. And then we're getting all sorts of issues because these are connected systems, right? They feel separate to us because we don't see where the aquifer intercepts this, the base flow of the stream, but they really matter. So we're getting then impacts on the amount of water, on water temperature, which is super important for different, particularly for like salmonid fish. So if you are into eating or fishing for brook trout or any kind of trout or salmon, these are things that you have to think about. So that's a great unintended consequence one. Another one that I study a lot has to do with market-based solutions to environmental issues. And this is something that I imagine you all meaning you all debaters will want to think about, because I'm sure, or I would guess that part of what you want to do is come up with options. Either if you're promoting regulation or not, you need to be able to say what that would look like. And one very kind of big thing that people are thinking right now is market-based solutions. And you may be familiar with the idea of carbon markets, because that's the most common environmental market that gets coverage in the newspaper and stuff. But there are similar markets in relation to water quality to a lesser extent, but just the presence of water and the health of streams and rivers under the Clean Water Act. And that's one of the main things that I study, and I think there have been a lot of unintended consequences from that as we figure out how to try to make those markets work.
So I would love to go deeper into that particular claim, because it's clear that a lot of your research dives into the term neoliberalism and environmentalism and regulations. And so a lot of suggestions provided by other colleagues are how we can use those market incentives as being kind of the best way to deter, penalize, and promote good behaviors that take into account economic consequences. And so students, in all likelihood, are going to be scouring, the web to find examples of how these types of market solutions may have backfired or caused problems, stripped or empowered certain populations over others. Is that something that you also found in your research as well?
Yeah, and I can talk about other people's research as well. So what I focus on most closely is called mitigation banking, or compensatory mitigation, under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And if this is something you all are curious about, there is a really great introductory piece by Palmer Huff and Morgan Robertson that came out in 2009, and I'm happy to give Brian the citation for that, but that gives you an overview of the history of compensatory mitigation and how it gets going. But the basic idea is that you may envision US environmental regulation as saying, thou shalt not harm. Okay, the Endangered Species Act is written that way, for example, and that's how it's been enforced for quite a bit of our history. Okay, the Clean Water Act was never enforced that way. Okay, it was taken instead of a thou shalt not, it has been well, we don't want you to do that. And what we're going to say is, if you propose a project that is going to physically damage a water of the US, which is a technical term that you're going to run into a bunch as you do this work. Okay? If you're going to physically damage a water of the US, then you are supposed to go through something called the mitigation sequence. So the idea is that first you should avoid harm. So imagine for a minute that you are a developer with a parcel of land where you want to put a housing development, and there is a stream that is inconveniently located right where you want your parking lot. Okay. So the first thing you're supposed to do is think about, could you move the parking lot? Could you avoid the impact? If you can't, then the idea is to minimize the impact. Like, could you sort of move the parking lot so it goes around it and put a bridge over the stream, right? Could you do something that would reduce the impact? And then the last step of it is, if there are impacts that you cannot avoid, you are supposed to compensate for them by restoring a comparable ecosystem somewhere else. So what's happened with the enforcement of the Clean Water Act, and there are multiple commentators that have talked about this, this is not just me saying this, is that we unfortunately have, in a lot of projects, skip right to the final step of compensatory mitigation, of how do we make up for the harm. Because by the time the US Army Corps of Engineers were the people that do the permitting for the Clean Water Act, by the time they see a project, it's already at a 60% level of design. A lot of money's come into it. Like, it's quite a long ways along the way to being a realized project, which means it's very expensive to do major changes. So what we get then is not thou shalt not harm, but yeah, go ahead and do the harm as long as you pay to have a comparable amount of restoration done somewhere else. Okay, so those are the markets I study, is this market for how do you produce the restoration somewhere else to offset the stream that you just put in a culvert in your parking lot so that you could build your parking lot. Yeah. Okay. How's that doing as an explanation so far?
This is perfect.
Okay.
So can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Please do. Yes.
Okay. So let's say that we take a large Clean Water Act being an example. This seems like it is a typical enforcement mechanism, a type of punishment to try to deter problematic behaviors and incentivize better behaviors. Now, one of the things that often happens within debate rounds is students will find a problem, and then they will suggest a solution, but they may be relatively vague about it. So do we think that this type of mitigation approach to water is something that is relatively kind of normalized or consistent across a lot of environmental logic chains? I know that you mentioned one, which is thou shalt not in the context of the Endangered Species Act, but what about others? Are there similar patterns in how we enforce this legislation?
There is, and I also realized, sorry, are you?
Yep, no, in regulations, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I said
so
legislation.
There are similar patterns, and then also I didn't talk to you about impacts from this approach. So we'll get there in a minute.
Right.
So the Endangered Species Act now has its own version of this approach, which is called habitat or conservation banking. And in fact, this general approach is fairly popular in international environmental policy circles. You'll see it most often under mitigation banking or under biodiversity offsetting, or offsetting is the most common word internationally. And there are offsetting markets on every continent except Antarctica at this point. And they are for a really wide variety of environmental goods that they are trying to protect.
Okay. And how good are we at, before we even get to what this does to the areas that are offset, how good are we comparing apples to apples in terms of offsetting those costs? And who makes those decisions?
Yeah, so the people that make the decisions these are all what are called regulatory markets. Okay, so they are not the same as a free market. This is a situation in which a regulatory agency, so an environmental agency, says, all right, we're going to use a market-based approach. You, the developer of the housing things, you are going to have to follow these regulations, and you are going to have to purchase credit. I haven't explained quite how this works. Let me take one step back. So you're the housing developer with your lot where you want to build housing with this inconveniently located stream in the parking lot. Okay. You apply to the Army Corps for a permit. The Army Corps says, all right, you may go ahead and do this. You may do this damage, but you have to pay to have a comparable resource somewhere else restored. What they are telling you to buy is a mitigation credit. Okay, so it's called a stream credit. That's what's for sale in this market. In the meantime, there has been an entrepreneur in your geographic area and geographic area is something you should pay attention to. It's called the service area, and it can be small or large depending on where you are. But so there's someone in your service area who has done the work of producing these stream credits or these mitigation credits up front. So they have purchased access to land that has a degraded stream on it. They have put forward a plan to restore that stream that's been approved by the Army Corps of Engineers. They've gone ahead and done that restoration, and they've had it monitored over time, depending on the state they're in, depending on the Army Corps district they're in, for 3 to 7 years. And so they're the ones that have the credits for sale. So this is a commodity market for these environmental goods, these stream credits. It's kind of wild. So just to clarify that. So in terms of, so the regulators are the people that set this up. In terms of comparing apples to apples, it's pretty hard because we have very, very little data about the outcomes of these projects. So it's very difficult to know how successful they are. There's a study I could send, and I'm forgetting right now who the author is, where they looked at they did a huge lit search for for looking at these compensatory mitigation offsetting projects, and they found like 16,000 plus articles, and I want to say that only 30 of them had any discussion of the consequences or the outcomes of the projects at all. And so we're very good about talking about why this makes sense. This market-based solution makes sense as an approach, and we know very little about whether it actually works.
So, I mean, we're talking about less than 50 years of a type of science, right? Like where did this idea come from? Did it,
Yeah.
I mean, is that one of the problems? So when we're talking about ecosystems aren't a 50-year thing. You know, they exist over a long time.
So for sure, part of the problem is the timing. So the first, what gets pointed to as the first of these environmental markets was for air quality credits under the Clean Air Act in relation to, this is the Montreal Protocol stuff. So this is in relation to acid rain and the hole in the ozone layer, right? That's where we get the first permit-based trading environmental market system. Okay, and that's 40 years now, I think. I'm not quite sure about that. The kinds of markets I study for wetland banking and mitigation banking, wetland banking gets started in the early 90s, and the first mitigation market for streams starts in 1998. So these are relatively young practices, and that is definitely part of it. But even so, part of why we don't know is that no one studies it, right? There's no financial incentive for the people that create these projects, the mitigation bankers themselves, to go back and look. And there's no way that the regulators have time or ability or money to go back and look. So it depends on scientists studying these projects. And many biophysical scientists don't want to study them because it's not even relatively pristine, right? We know that humans have totally reconfigured these ecosystems. So many scientists don't want to study them. So there's really, really a just mind-bogglingly tiny amount of data about the impacts of these projects, despite the fact that that's what we've been advocating that we should do as a solution.
How many of these projects, just offhand, I know we don't have the data in front of us, but how many of these things exist?
That's a really good question to which I don't have a good answer at hand. I know I have those numbers in my book, but I don't have them in the front of my head, for which I apologize.
But is this something that's in everybody's backyard?
No, it's not. It's less common than that. Wetland projects are more common than stream projects. But stream projects are increasingly common because if you think about how like a highway, for example, cuts across a landscape, it's going to intersect a lot of streams along the way, whereas wetlands are not, it's not as likely to impact a wetland, yeah, because they're in a blob rather than a vector, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So stream things are increasingly common. The habitat banking or conservation banking stuff, that's going to really depend what state you're in. So the last time I looked, 75% of them were in California, which was the first place that started them. And they're much more common in the Western US. So if you're in the Western US, you're a lot more likely to have a conservation banking or habitat banking project near you.
So let's talk consequences. Restoration sounds wonderful. There's no way this could become an issue where companies are able to decide maybe the cheapest replacement product possible.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I find the possibility of restoration incredibly inspiring, right? It's what gets me out of bed in the morning because if you think about the US environmental movement, we have these three main threads, right? We have preservation, which is the idea that that nature needs to be walled off and protected from us as people. That as people, as human beings, we can only pollute or destroy nature. Okay, so think about a national park, yeah, and the limitations on that. There's conservation, which is the idea that nature is there not for its intrinsic value, but for our use. Okay, and then there's restoration, which says humans and the environment around us are part of a community, and we have the same obligations to a stream that we have to a sick neighbor, right? Like that to me is totally inspiring. I love that idea. And I think it's so important as we understand, you know, think about the world around us. I don't know if your debaters are going to know about the idea of the Anthropocene and the idea that at this point, humans are the defining feature of this entire friggin' geologic epic, right? Like we have had such a huge impact. We got to think about how we make things better, right? I feel like that's absolutely fundamental. So restoration to me we've got to figure out how to do this. the thing is that it's really hard and complicated, right? If ecosystems are extremely complex thing. If you think about streams, and I'm going to say, you know, like my arm does not make a great drainage network, but it's what I got at this moment. Like, let's say you want to restore something right here. You are at the mercy of everything that's happening upstream from you and in the watershed all around. Streams are integrators, as Ellen Wall, who is an amazing professor, an amazing geomorphologist, says. Streams are integrators. That means that they collect everything. Yeah. So we could do the best project possible here, and if someone does something stupid here, it could wipe out what we did. It's just hard. Okay, so given that it's hard, it's not surprising that a lot of the stuff we're doing right now doesn't seem to be working very well. Okay, so the data that we do have finds no ecological benefit from the kind of big restoration, and by that I mean getting out big yellow equipment and changing the shape of the channel, you know, using cutting back to open up floodplains if a channel is incised, putting back in meanders if it's been straightened, the kind of really, really big flashy changes, flashy not in the sense of hydrologic flashiness, but in the sense of like, woo, wow, look at that, right? We have, as far as we can tell, those don't do anything, which is so depressing to me. Like, I can't even tell you. So,
as in, like the animals don't come back, or
as in it doesn't,
it's still going to have heavy metal problems and things like that.
Yeah, so it doesn't improve water quality, as that we don't have evidence that it improves water quality. We have evidence that it actually increases the temperature of the water in many cases, because they have to cut down all the existing trees to be able to do this reconfiguration. It takes a while for them to grow back. So we have evidence of temporary increases in water temperature. We don't have increases in, we don't have evidence of increased sort of improvement in the biodiversity of what uses the channel. So it's physically, it's clearly in better shape, but the Clean Water Act says physical, biological, and chemical integrity. I think I probably have the order of those things wrong, but all three of those things. It tackles the physical integrity, but it doesn't seem to be providing any ecological lift, which is the term that the Clean Water Act uses to say, did it make things better or not? So that's terrifying. And, you know, especially given that that is enormously expensive to do this work. Right? It makes me think like that we really need to think more carefully about what we are asking the people that provide the mitigation credits to do. Because these are smart, thoughtful, really motivated people doing this work, but they don't make the rules, right? The regulators make the rules for what they have to do. So as far as I can tell, the rules we're using right now are not working all that well. And that's, you know, I say that on the basis of 14 years of research with a geomorphologist at Duke named Martin Doyle. And the two of us have really put in a lot of work to try to figure this out. And we really think the rules need to change about what you get mitigation credit for. So what that commodity for sale should actually be. And I could say more about that.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Well, so I would love to ask a follow-up question, I think, after this one, which is sort of the issue of large national entities that are broken off into geographic areas. So you mentioned the Army Corps of Engineers has areas that they're divided into and responsibilities, but they're largely underfunded, not enough personnel. And I would love to hear more about maybe the relationship of that, kind of their decision-making capacity and its relationship to kind of the localities and histories of people around streams.
Yeah. So let me first, if I may share my screen for a minute, I want to just pull up one image for you, which will show you. If you look at this with care, you'll see that it doesn't follow state boundaries. Okay. In some cases, the state and the Army Corps district are the same, but in other cases, they're not. Okay, so, and there are some states that have multiple Army Corps districts that cover different parts of them. So this is the idea that I want to talk about of environmental federalism, which is the idea that we set our environmental policy at the federal level, and then the regions of each agency do interpretive work and have a surprising amount of independence. So in the Army Corps, what we're talking about is these big divisions, and then within them, the districts. Okay. The way that these policies get implemented is different in every district on this picture, which is kind of mind-boggling to contemplate. So there are some general overall guidelines they all have to follow about like response times when someone puts in an application for a new mitigation bank and things along those lines. And then there are some divisional goals and shared things, shared practices, but the head of each district has an enormous amount of independence to make judgments and set practices for their district. Okay. Then you need to overlap that with the EPA. Which has a number of regions that don't overlap with these divisions. Okay. And then within each EPA region, they also have independence and oversight, right? So you get these many different layers, right? And then also the states. So in Indiana, where we are right now, the state has just removed protection for many kinds of wetlands. So you have this kaleidoscope picture of, or maybe patchwork would be a better way to put it, of different levels of regulatory jurisdiction in the US, which is this idea of federalism, that some authorities are devolved downwards, which makes it pretty complex as a regulatory picture.
So can you give some examples about how this regulatory overlap causes interesting conflicts or instances in which maybe the left hand is doing one thing and the right hand is doing another and not knowing what either is doing?
Yeah. So, I mean, so part of it is that if you're trying to think about how to change the rules for these markets, how to redefine what the commodity for sale is, in some sense, you're going to have to convince all, what is it? I'm going to get this number wrong. I think it's 38 or 39 heads of core districts. Right? You can't just do it at the national level. You got to get everybody, right? So that is a kind of interesting thing about all this, but it also means you have room to experiment, right? So one of the big problems with how we do mitigation now is that it privileges the kinds of really big channel reconstruction that I was just telling you about. But what evidence we have suggests that there are some kinds of projects that have much more positive impact. So for example, removing dams. So for quite a while, removing dams wasn't an allowed mitigation strategy. And then we had a pioneer in North Carolina, Restoration Systems, a mitigation banking company there, that really wanted to do a dam removal project. So they talked with the Army Corps regulatory office out of Wilmington, and they just went through many, many years of conversations before they finally got permission to do that. And now there are multiple districts that allow dam removal as mitigation credit, but multiple. Last time I checked, it was 5 or 6 across the whole country.
And we have thousands of what they call deadbeat dams that are neither owned nor people take responsibility over them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that's an example where the federalist structure was, it's in some ways it's useful in that it allows these laboratories for experiment, and in other ways it's difficult because it means that a good solution can take a really long time to spread because it isn't implemented top down. Although I do think there's now federal consideration of having dam removal. I think that we either just got or are about to get nationwide permission for dam removal as a mitigation thing. But it means that these projects can take a whole lot of negotiation as you're trying to satisfy what the local Army Corps district thinks, the local EPA region, the local state agencies, right? Like for your specific area, it's a lot of different, it makes it for a pretty complex process.
So, let's say that this the restorative approach occurs. And then somebody in the area wants to do something that impacts that particular restorative project. How long does that project have to maybe remain untouched? Does that create issues as well?
That is a fabulous question. So right now, all mitigation projects have to be protected by conservation easements. Okay, they have to be, well, actually, let me say that differently. If the mitigation banker buys the property with the degraded stream on it that they're going to restore, if they buy that property outright, then typically what they do is donate it to a land trust. So like around IU, that would be the Sycamore Land Trust. There are thousands of land trusts across the country. So that's one way to do it. Or they can donate it to like the local parks authority or something along those lines, but that's less common. But mitigation bankers, sometimes they buy the land, but more often they buy a conservation easement. And I don't know how much your students are going to know about US property law, but the fact that it's a bundle of different rights, so that, you know, like there's the air rights and the mineral rights and the use rights, right? Like there are many different kinds of rights. So mostly what happens on these mitigation banks is that the development rights for the area around the stream or the wetland are protected through a conservation easement. And the idea is that that is in perpetuity. That is what the current model says. We have, and let me just say, like, when I talk with the people that design these projects, some of them have said to me, well, you know, we don't know if this super invasive, you know, seriously interventionist restoration project does anything good for the stream, but we do know that that stream now can never be, you know, put in a pipe, bulldozed, straightened, all these things, right? That stream is protected, and even if it takes 100 years for it to restore itself, it will have that time. The problem there is that we don't know what in perpetuity actually means, right? The oldest human institution in the US is what? Not in the US, in the world, Catholic Church, probably, I'm guessing. That's only a couple thousand, like, we haven't even hit, you know, like, perpetuity, what does that actually mean? I'm being incoherent here, but we're only just starting to get the first lawsuits of new owners challenging conservation easements. And I think that's something to watch, because if they succeed in getting conservation easements overturned, then the whole way we organize mitigation, compensatory mitigation, is going to need to be revisited.
Wow. So what other major topic do you think we should transition to? Because I can ask several questions, but, you know, obviously you have lots of content, and I want to make sure that we touch on the core issues that you think are of great significance for anybody that's a stakeholder in the Anthropocene, as you reference it.
Sure. So I'm gonna bring up 3 or 4 things, which I suspect you've already heard some of from other people, but just to flag them.
Mm-hmm.
So one is this question of Indigenous treaty rights, which is particularly turning into an issue for anyone that wants to talk about endangered species in water, so salmon protection in particular in the West. If you want a great, really controversial example, look at the Klamath River Basin, which is Klamath, where Indigenous groups there fought to get their treaty rights recognized, and that has enormous impacts for local farmers. We're in the middle of a historic drought. All sorts of craziness is breaking loose, like the gentleman from the Malheur occupation, Clive Bundy has set up at like one of the outlet places in the Klamath to try to like argue that he's going to break it open for irrigation. Like, it is a nutty situation. The thing that I want to point to here is that a lot of what's going on with tribal water rights are around water quantity, but also water temperature. And that is a critical thing to think about in relation with climate change, because a lot of the fish that we care about the most, that we like to eat, salmon and trout, salmonids, depend on cold water. And that is getting harder and harder with the warming climate. So I think just treaty rights in general, and this question of water temperature is a big one for people to think about. Another thing that I think it's really important for people to look at under this topic is the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is not the same thing as the Clean Water Act. Just even, you know, the Office of Management and Budget the OMB has these great succinct reports about different pieces of legislation. I don't know if your students would be familiar with those, but it lays out really clearly the fact that we only monitor a small number of contaminants in our water. And we do not monitor, we don't think about synergies between them, when we set the standards for what are the allowable levels of these chemicals in our water. So that's another, I think, really important thing to think about. Another thing that I think it's going to be related to the drinking water is thinking about environmental justice impacts of all of these water related resources. So, you know, that is things like who is differentially exposed to negative impacts, but it's also we're thinking about who is differentially limited from access to environmental goods. So with restoration projects, there's some work that's shown that they get disproportionately clustered in areas that are primarily white and of high socioeconomic backgrounds. And so that's something to think about as well. And then the last thing I think was thinking about was going back to your point about the dams, and thinking about how we actually do dam removal, because there are, I think, something like 60,000 dams in the US at the moment. And thinking about how to manage those is another kind of interesting issue, like especially if you have students who are in New England. There are all sorts of communities that want to keep their historic dams.
Just, they have no purpose just
Yeah,
to
but
look at them?
they are important aesthetic and cultural landmarks for communities, and they're really opposed to tearing them down. And that to me, that intersection, I mean, you know, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar myself. I study physical science and social science, and I think the dam removal question is such a great example of that, because you have so many different economic and social and physical factors coming together.
But the aesthetics of the change in the environment kind of being embedded into the environment itself as a historic, symbolic representation that has more value than the actual environmental impact is something that I find interesting.
Yeah, it's really it's an interesting thing. Yeah.
So yeah, well, that's fascinating. Okay, so here's a question. One of the things that debaters often do is think about kind of philosophical approaches to dealing with the environment, and that can go in any possible direction, whether thinking about anthropocentrism, you know, you were mentioning market-based approaches, and things like that. What type of suggestions do you have for students that want to think about water from maybe a unique perspective than what would be, quote, the norm in K through 12 education? Texts or literature that they should dive into, because, you know, these debates are great, they can win and lose them, but really the hope is, after a year of doing this research, and a part of it could be reading nonfiction, and part of it could also be reading fiction, and how that influences them as stakeholders, as environmental advocates, and just members of our society going forward. Do you have suggestions or core pieces that you would suggest that anybody should read, even contemporary policymakers?
Yeah. So one of the ideas that I find the most powerful right now is the movement to give bodies of water legal standing, to give them legal personhood. And, you know, there are debates about whether or not that's a good way to go, for sure. But I think it is one of the most powerful things that I've seen, because it gives sort of human guardians the opportunity to advocate on behalf of these water bodies. And nobody, you know, right now there are particular constituencies that advocate for our environmental resources, but this is kind of taking it to a whole different level of giving people kind of legal guardianship requirements to advocate for the well-being of the thing that they are the guardian for, and then the ability to collect monetary damages and apply them, right? So this is, there's a river in India, there's a river in New Zealand. I believe the citizens of Toledo, I'm not sure I've got that right, voted for legal personhood for Lake Erie, right? There's a bunch of people that are thinking about this as a tool that would allow a really big change in how we deal with the environment. I will say, you know, I study market-based approaches. I will say for myself that I really worry about them. I think that once you put a dollar value on something, like the whole purpose of putting a dollar value on something is to make it interchangeable and to make it equivalent with other things, right? That's what money is for. It is to save us the time and complexity of barter, right? So once we do that with the environment, I feel like we lose something really important. And, you know, I talk about that with my students a lot, of what does it mean to value something? And I think monetary value is seductive. Like, we think, oh, we have failed to communicate to people the importance of the environment. like we have a constituency for the environment, but that constituency is only part of the population, and it hasn't, it hasn't grown. It hasn't kind of made inroads in larger population. And people, it's really easy to think that the way to expand that is to put into a language that people understands, and that language is dollars, right? That it's the lingua franca of modern life. So I totally get why that seems appealing, but I really worry about what that brings with it. Because once you start valuing things in dollars, it does a couple things. So first of all, if I make an argument that the campus river, which is behind you on your screen right now, that is worth $100,000 a year to Indiana University in terms of recreational use, drawing alumni dollars, right? I could do these things. You could come back to me, or someone could come back and say, well, yes, but if we developed a new building on that site, it would bring in IU $150,000, right? Like you could, once you do money, I feel like you can always find something that's more valuable. So there's that problem. And then I also think it kind of gives away the game that the reason why the campus river matters on the Indiana University campus is the students love it, right? People spend time there, they walk there with their friends, they lie on the banks and read, right? It has a kind of emotional value to us that transcends its monetary value. And I feel like that gets lost. Right? I think about how we talk about hurricanes or natural disasters, right? When we talk about a hurricane, we say it caused, $8 billion in damage and killed 167 people, whatever. It's a way of giving you the scale of the disaster. But when you think about those 167 people, it doesn't say, right, that is 167, high school sweethearts, arch enemy that you never got to one up, grandmothers, right? Like it doesn't say who those people were. It doesn't tell us why they matter to us. And it doesn't tell us similarly what all the losses mattered to people. And so therefore I worry about market-based solutions. And I think, I don't know that this legal standing for environmental entities is necessarily the best solution, but I feel like it's one interesting path forward that encourages us to think about the environment around us more holistically, rather than trying to communicate its value to others through dollars.
So, one follow-up question that I would have then on that is if are there philosophers or writers that have influenced you on that very question, the sense of environmentness that cannot be adequately represented by dollars?
Yeah.
Whether it's poetry or film or anything else, is there, something that you think, beyond just looking at the policy matters, high school students look into this too?
Yeah. So I will just say that I am still just an enormous fan of Aldo Leopold's The Land Ethic essay. I teach it almost every year, and I think it is so powerful. So I would point to that. I would also point to works by Indigenous scholars, and there's a big range of them, but like Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, and there's a bunch of other stuff that is escaping me at this moment. I'm sorry, I have a really terrible head for references. And I would be happy to send them to you. But
any list I can put up either on the screen or place into the comments of the YouTube page. Yep.
Yeah, I find so there's just some really powerful work there. And on this question of legal standing, if you're curious about it, there's the initial law article about this is actually really, really readable. It's by Christopher Stone from 1974, and it's called Should Trees Have Standing? And I find that just a powerful piece.
That's great. All right. So just to be mindful of your time, any other issues, topics, terms that students should use for research, or anything else that I failed to ask that you think that they should know about before they venture on into this topic?
So for sure, they want to be thinking about Waters the US and redefinitions of Waters the US.
Which WOTUS just recently, they just recently announced that they're going to reverse the reversal from Trump, right?
Just head spinning.
Yeah.
What are the things? So so in my world, the ecological lift is a term to think about. Compensatory mitigation, compensatory mitigation or offsetting is a good term. Questions around groundwater recharge and the connectivity of ground and surface water. Another thing that we haven't touched on at all, but that has a huge impact on water quality, particularly in Appalachia, is mining and coal mining, right? So the Surface Mining Reclamation Act, whatever that is, I'm losing the acronym right now. There's some totally crazy stuff about how stream restoration works around mountaintop removal mining, like just nuts. And there's great work that Emily Bernhardt and her colleagues at Duke have done about the water quality impacts of mining. So that's another really intense one. And actually, that's going to be a huge thing going forward as the US moves into, for renewable energy production, we need batteries, right? Because renewable energy is not constant. So the water impacts from lithium mining is going to be a huge thing. That's another thing to think about.
Can I ask you about your take? So hydraulic fracturing in all likelihood is going to be a core aspect of the debate as well. And you go out there and you can watch videos, and the industry says, the water is going to be injected and protected. There's no way it's going to affect groundwater or anything else. This also matters for Appalachia, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, even areas of Indiana, I think. How confident do you think that we should feel in some of maybe the corporate kind of responses where it's like, we absolutely will protect it, it'll be fine?
I'm a big fan of trust but verify. So I would love it if we could get the chemical components of the wastewater, if we could get careful analysis of that. Whereas right now, my understanding is that most of that is considered proprietary information, so we don't see it. That said, what I do know from talking with people about it, from talking with chemists and such, means that I am actually not as concerned about the water impacts of fracking as I am about the kind of ecological and social impacts of fracking. I'm also more worried about
so ecological in the context of methane release and CO2 impact, or also the landscape
fragmentation.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a big thing that we're not talking about with it. But I also think about work by a scholar at Northeastern University named Sarah Wiley, talking about the health impacts, the human health impacts from, I want to say it's hydrogen sulfide gas that gets released. So I would say that to me, I am less worried about the water impacts than I am worried about other impacts from fracking. But I don't have the data. None of us do, right? So I may be totally wrong about that, but this is my sense of it, that in fact, we're probably having a bigger impact on our water resources from all the road salt we put on than we are from the fracking water. Like if I was gonna quantify which was the thing I was most worried about in terms of water quality, I would go with road salt. And I'm serious. I mean, I realize that sounds flippant, but I actually, from what I know about hydrogeologic fracking, I've actually written about it. And from the data we have, my sense is that it's a less serious impact on water.
So this is actually a question that I've asked several people so far, and I ask, how is our data relative to this stuff? So I think you've identified one, which is sometimes industry's proprietary data is protected for intellectual property reasons. And so that creates transparency problems. But what about just measurement of our ecological impacts? So road salt is an example that you identified. I mean, do we measure that adequately? Are we investing enough in nonprofits or government entities to fully vet this? Or are we always kind of behind the curve?
I would love to spend more money on monitoring. And it's not a very fancy or, exciting topic, but it is staggering to me how little we know about our impacts. And I will give you an example. So the argument is that the need to protect resources is so urgent that we can't take the time or spend the money to look at the impacts of what we've already tried to protect. And I get it. Like, I can totally understand. Like, I have deep empathy with that argument. And I also feel like, it just means we need to pull in more money. Because what I hear from regulators, and I've actually spent like a good 20 years now interviewing regulators across the US for my work. And what I hear from them uniformly is that they do not have enough money or enough time. And let me make this really clear to you how extremely they do not have enough money or time. So there is something that regulators on both the West Coast and the East Coast have talked to me about called the rule of twos. And on the West Coast, what that means is that the maximum amount of time that regulators can spend looking at a particular resource is they can send 2 people for 2 days. And environmental scientists hear this and they just flip, right? Because they will spend, years studying a particular resource and still feel like they don't understand the complexity of that system. Okay, so on the West Coast, 2 people for 2 days. On the East Coast, that is 2 people for 2 hours. It's nothing, right? You just can't understand what's happening. And it's, again, let me just say how impressed I have been with the regulators I have interviewed, right? Again, super thoughtful, super committed, good people, and they just don't have the time or the money to collect the data they need. And so I feel like, that would be huge. There's so much uncertainty that we don't have to have this level of uncertainty, right? We could try to figure some of this stuff out. It would just require some money and some time, and finding that's always the hard part.
So last question. If somebody wants to be an environmental advocate and care about the things that you care about, or tangential or related issues, why become a geographer?
Oh, I'm a huge geographer chauvinist, so I have very passionate answers to that question.
All right.
What I will say is that geography is the one place in the university where the entire spectrum of intellectual inquiry is under one roof. So we go from hardcore physical and kind of chemical science in through social science and the humanities, and it's all in one place, and everybody's thinking about the environment and people's relationship with it. And what it means is that there is almost no topic that you are interested in that can't be a topic in geography. You will never be bored. You will hear, your classes cover this amazing range of stuff. The talks and lectures you hear cover this amazing range of stuff. It is to me, it is the place that is bringing everything together. So in my department, for example, we have people that are looking at, race and racial violence in cities. We have people that are looking at immigration and refugee crises. We have people that are looking at food security, which has been such a big issue this past year. We have people that are looking at the physical and social impacts of increasing natural disasters in relation to climate change, right? We're all in one place. It's very cool.
So and they should come to Indiana University for that, right?
They absolutely should. We take our undergraduate very seriously. People get involved in our research all the time. Yeah, definitely.
Rebecca, really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time. And, I look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, me too. My pleasure. And I, just to all the debaters, you have your hands, you got the tiger by the tail. It's a big, big issue, but it's a fabulous issue and it's so important. So good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah.